And we have a really great presentation coming up from Ian Trow with Harmonic. You've heard of Harmonic. They're a big company. And he's going to be talking about implementing cloud-based video production. It's all about the cloud nowadays. This is the man with the answers.
Okie dokie. Thank you very much for the introduction. And thanks for staying around for the end of the session, although I can see you've all got your badges scanned and firmly got your eyes on the $200. I'll try and make it as interesting as possible, and certainly from some of the earlier sessions there were questions about ingesting video for live streaming, so I'll try and answer that. As you can probably tell, I'm not an American, but I work for an American company. I'm based in the UK, report to the US, the best combination ever. I'm in charge of emerging technology, so I get left alone during the daylight hours to think about things, and the areas that I'm currently working on are UHD, HDR, HEVC, targeted advertising, cloud, and a lot of the security type questions. What I was going to talk about is implementing cloud-based video production, a very, very big topic. I won't cover it all, but hopefully I'll cover the bits that you find important yourselves. From our customers' perspective, what you're looking at in me, and in me turning up to this kind of event, is new world meets old world. You know, a lot of Harmonic's business has typically been in products prior to dedicated servers coming out. Virtualization gets talked about in a broadcast sense, and attending something like this where you've got a healthy mix of IT, media and broadcast people, I'm always very careful about using that term virtualization, because a lot of it for the heavy lift functions like servers and video encoders, virtualization typically means porting onto another platform and not the fully distributed model that most people are familiar with. We're seeing a lot of people who are interested in the cloud, hence the presentation title, moving the infrastructure to the cloud for production, and also multi-cloud, where people are actually talking about quite advanced delivery processes. So, well, we'll go to old school techniques then. I put this slide on, typical American business commercial type slide, and I did it very deliberately. I don't use any of these slides normally, but the reason why I did it is that most people think that the move to cloud and to virtualization is primarily technical. Not at all. It is all about business. And usually the idea for moving to the cloud has been cooked up by somebody who's more on the commercial side and on the technical side, and that strikes fear into the hearts of anyone who's actually sort of interested in deploying that kind of infrastructure. One of the key things that I think a lot of people have been discussing, and particularly some of the questions that came up in the session this morning, is about low latency OTT streaming. As I said in the introduction, Harmonic's really known for live linear encoding from a traditional point of view, although if you're staying in these kind of media markets, you've got to embrace the new delivery mechanisms. And I think that it goes without saying that any of the big broadcasters are actually becoming hybrid in nature in terms of what distribution infrastructure. And certainly for things like UHD, the whole idea that you're getting the same transition that we had from SD to HD is not going to happen from HD to UHD. I think that one of the reasons why OTT streaming has come up big style, particularly for 4K markets, is that movie streaming channels, sports subscription channels, it suits the kind of demographic trends where people are actually looking to embrace that. And it also suits a lot of the legislative side of things where DTT spectrum is coming under a lot of pressure. But then that actually brings in some fairly serious issues to do with quality of experience. You know, we all know that in the past there have been big discrepancies between deterministic broadcast services and packet-based IP delivery. The interactive programming, I think that clearly OTT and the more genre-based catch-up TV, time shift type applications, a lot of people are tending to sort of view in that style. And this business about unified OTT and broadcast architectures, another background reason for cloud adoption is that a lot of the broadcasters have felt mandated to actually deliver their content on multiple platforms. It's absolutely hemorrhaged their margins. And I think that one of the things that they're looking for is some degree of commonality across platforms. So this idea about unifying OTT with existing broadcast infrastructure is important. And then the last thing is that if you actually looked at any of the traditional broadcasters in terms of the biggest expense that they actually have, it's actually in set-top box infrastructure. And if you can get away from the set-top box infrastructure and start operating in ubiquitous players that are available, you're in a much better situation. So in terms of what we're dealing with, I'll sort of do the full build on this. Most people, when they're interested in a low latency OTT workflow, the only real distinction you get is in things like packaging, in the playout, but people really want to have that kind of commonality, and people also want to have equivalent latencies between broadcast and multi-screen services. Now, one of the things that I think is particularly interesting here, and going around the show and talking to people, is the biggest culprit in terms of latency is actually associated with the CDN. And it's quite interesting to hear, sort of a lot of the differing technologies there, because from some of the established vendors, the CDN is a fixed parameter of which, sort of they're dealing with thousands of clients. Media is one of them, and actually tackling that kind of latency is not something that they can do in a bespoke manner. This very much is an old school slide, but I put it in deliberately, and I hastily put it in after this morning, actually. I usually sort of do the slides the night before. But this thing that you're talking about, live content that has an SDI origin, and you need to get it into an IP workflow, a lot of people gloss over that. I think there are some important things to be said here, is that if you go to NAB or IBC or any of the big conferences, you're aware that a lot of effort's been taken for taking SDI and packaging it up as IP in SMPTE 2022-6. I think that there's a little bit of an impasse in the industry because people like what they see with that, but they want it to go a stage further, where all of the other compressed formats for dealing with IP are what people really want. So yes, we're in this sort of juncture between SDI and IP, but the other area that we're also got to consider is the legacy transport stream. A lot of people, if you're talking about hybrid type networks that are dealing with IP and transport streams, you will get a healthy mix of them, especially in environments where there's turnaround. So I'm going to get brave again and see whether the clicker actually works, and yes, it does. So if you're actually looking at this, I made the distinction that virtualized applications for playout solutions, and I've been at some conferences where I've absolutely been crucified for using the word virtualization, because for heavy playout type applications, and the reason for concentrating on this is that really a lot of the solutions that people are looking about to outsource production capability and be able to use it as a service are based around the playout area. That's the biggest issue. So not only playout, but also graphics and branding. And you get a very healthy mix of uncompressed and compressed origination of material. So, really the playout server is actually the central element to it. What's behind a lot of all of the functionality there, and I think this outlines the real emphasis of why people are actually using cloud rather than traditional services, is that they have a bursty need for things. They also have a need for flexibility in terms of graphics branding, in terms of the various APIs. And I think that One of the other things that's crept up is that a lot of the traditional players, their first stab at doing cloud or virtualization type products was merely to take the products that they'd known and loved and made lots of money out of, actually make them aware as a software product, probably make them aware as a VM, but completely missing the whole benefit of actually moving to the cloud, because there are distinct benefits to it. And I think that that's what people are really after. They're after the business need to be recognized. And for video production, there's a big need. You know, that a lot of content producers are getting away from actually administering their own infrastructure, but they do want answers on this live low latency. They need it for SLA type purposes. And the hidden word that's always talked about, and I thought it would come up in the 5 things about the cloud discussion, was that at least at the end somebody will put their hands up and ask about the security question, because that's a big subliminal question that lots of people have. But it didn't arise. But I think that most of the times that I've talked about the cloud, if you implement the right security strategies, it can be equally as secure. If you're using a public cloud provider, they have people specially trained in there, but the key thing for you is to not introduce backdoors as being a developer, and for actually being aware of it and be aware of the security implications from the outset. This show's great, because I think that one of the things that's very, very clear is that unlike times gone by, where solutions will be made up of distinct products, actually what we're now seeing is that broadcasters are actually demanding for us to dig a level deeper and actually effectively do bespoke engineering. Any of the big cloud or virtualization deliveries that have been made, I think that they've always presented companies like mine with a dilemma that they'd love to be able to cookie cut each of the solutions and to be able to develop for one big name and then sell it to another. And that if you go around, one of the benefits, I think, of streaming media is that there are a whole host of people here who've got specific skills that are all needed, and all needed to be packaged up in a subtly different way for each of the broadcasters, because they all tackle it in a different way. And I particularly mean about this orchestration aspect of it. And that's really, if you fail to grasp the orchestration aspects of the cloud, in a way you're kind of missing the point of what it's trying to achieve. So yeah, sure, you know, it's about asset acquisition, you know, forming channels, establishing the primary distribution methods, but that's all taken for granted. In terms of the service and in terms of how you craft it, it's really going to be the business guys who are sort of saying, you know, we've adopted the cloud because of flexibility, to do with moving more to an OPEX model and a service-based structure. So you do really need to form a new sort of OTT workflow, and particularly this thing about network PVR. That's when you sort of can really start to exploit the benefits of the cloud versus more dedicated workflows. So the kind of things that we do with what we call our VOS functionality is deal with everything from ingest to delivery. You could very, very easily map all of the functionalities that you've got there onto product silos that we've previously had. But I mean, basically, anybody's interested in moving from ingest, so, you know, sort of the server ingest formats, to specifically answer the point that was raised earlier on. A lot of activity is people are looking at to say, we've got existing plant, we want to move to the cloud, we'll hand off to you at SDI. Some people will say we'll hand off at 2022-6, or alternatively, people will say they use fairly heavy compression, or running one of the compression schemes using a transport stream, or they'll be in the IP domain where they'll be using one of the production formats. And I think that's where a lot of the complexity behind the ingest formats, and where really the value added from a vendor who's got experience with video actually adds. And then you sort of move on to play out graphics, transcode. The transcode area is a really, really interesting one, because most people think either they have a very polarized view of it. It's either SD to HD or format type conversion, or it could be dealing with the different compression formats that there are. But now there are a whole host of other things that hit you, namely packaging formats, dealing with ABR, the origin server. That stage is in many respects where, you know, sort of all of the multi-screen aspects really start to hit. And then of course you've got encryption and delivery. So any one of those areas we used to do as a standalone box or solution, but continually now people are really looking at us, particularly for the production area and particularly where there's bursty demand, to actually be able to deliver there. So, you know, this is appropriate for IPTV and DTH or multi-screen, channel origination, which is dealing with a part subset of that, and also the primary distribution. Much of the work that's actually been done for cloud production is in the mom and pop affiliate type channel backhaul that goes on, and hence the emphasis on video production in the cloud. A lot of it relies on middleware. A lot of what we're doing is Linux based, so it's actually relied upon us actually crafting that. And I'd say one thing that in saying it's new meets old, you know, Harmonic has got a lot of legacy in the video world, and you know the company is primarily dealing with video handling all the way through from ingest through to delivery for both DTH and cable. But unless we actually come and adapt and actually work with other partners, we're not going to be long in the business. And I always find this very interesting, because streaming media is very, very different from IBC and from NAB. And I think the distinction is well deserved, you know, and the reputation for concentrating on streaming applications is very important, because whilst there's still arguably the 75 to 80% who are still live linear viewers, it's where the demographics going, and it's where the new services are coming that is causing the big demand in cloud-based infrastructure. So I mentioned this word orchestration, how we actually handle it, and how we actually interact with other partners. I think one of the things that's been very, very clear is, sure, there are a lot of flexibility, there are a lot of scaling issues that are to do with the cloud, but there's also a lot of bespoke nature to it in terms of how broadcasters have got different take, what their legacy is, what style of OTT type service they want to work with. And also some of the more obscure things like the database, development templates and the API integration. They were things that previously manufacturers like us wouldn't expose and didn't have to expose to actually work with other partners. But that's actually pretty critical for us. I wanted to say just a last few final words about this thing about private and public cloud. Everybody thinks that, you know, first they think about security, then they think about what style of cloud they're going to do, whether it's going to be private and cloud, and then they go on and develop it, and everybody lives happily ever after. But it doesn't happen like that, because usually what happens is that there's a hell of a lot of debating about private, public has a big impact on terms of the style of service and what functionality you need to deliver. So, you know, these are typically the kind of questions that people have got if they've got equipment on premise or they're considering using private or public cloud. In the interest of time, what I'll do is I'll just sort of spin through. In terms of the workflow, you also mentioned about how we actually deal with live feed. We actually developed a CloudLink development within Harmonic that we just sort of announced at NAB, which was specifically to deal with how to actually bring in and use all of those ingest formats in a cloud environment. Because I think sort of rocking up to a telco with your SDI or video doesn't really cut it. You know, I mean, if it isn't a file, they just don't know what to do with it. So that's how we actually deal with it. I do think that one of the most interesting things that I found at the show is the number of alternate different CDN and CDN selection technologies there are. And most of the private room or main floor demos I found really, really interesting in that respect. What can we say here, just to sort of finish off? Oh yeah, I think that the streaming formats, a lot of people have talked about this, HLS versus Dash, and all of the various streaming protocols. From a broadcast point of view, I've been really, really impressed with a few vendors who've dealt with orchestration, where any of the broadcasters can only address a very tiny minority of the existing players that there are out there for Android and iOS. And I think that's the big challenge, and that's where you really need to work with a partner who's done this before, so that you can get yourself up to that sort of 80–85% of the devices that there are out into the marketplace. And multicast, the degree of multicast that's actually support has a big bearing on how things actually scale. I realise that being a European here, this issue about net neutrality and how you can make things scale and the type of service has very, very different connotations between, you know, sort of North American tastes versus European tastes. But I think that that's something that everyone's got to be very aware of. And I know you've sat there really, really patiently where you're sort of saying, oh, I wish this British guy would just shut up so we can find out who's won the $200. And our man's here, isn't he?
Yes, thank you. And round of applause for Ian. He did a fantastic job.